So a couple of days after I posted my review of Beautiful World, Where Are You by Sally Rooney, my friend Tanner messaged me on Instagram and asked, what are some other books that people can read if they like Sally Rooney, or maybe if they don't like Sally Rooney, but they want to try something in the same vein? And I realized I've never seen one of these videos on YouTube. So I'm gonna do this kind of quick, rapid fire style and give you 15 book recommendations that I think you'll like if you like Sally Rooney, or if you're looking for books that are kind of like Sally Rooney. Here we go. Book number 1 is Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams. If you were someone who really connected with Marianne from Normal People, I think you'd really like this book. If you're someone who really connects with stories of kind of a young woman struggling to find herself, struggling to understand who she is and who she's becoming, I think you'd love this book. The book is about a young woman named Queenie who is Jamaican but is really struggling at her London newspaper job. She's really struggling to fit in with her white co-workers, and then when her white boyfriend breaks up with her, her life starts to spin out of control, and she starts to make all these decisions, especially with men, that she doesn't really feel good about. She's not really sure if she should be doing them or even why she's doing them. Next is The Idiot by Elif Batuman. If what you like about Sally Rooney is kind of young college students trying to find their way in the world, trying to find themselves at school, I think The Idiot is a really good next book for you. The book takes place over Celine's first year at Harvard, and if you've read Beautiful World, Where Are You, and really liked the email correspondence part of that, some of that is in this book too. During the year, Celine has kind of an email correspondence with a guy named Ivan. He's Hungarian, and he lives kind of across the world from her, but eventually in the book, she goes to Hungary, and she experiences the first rush of newfound love, and also the rush of kind of falling in love with writing. The Idiot is a little less plot-driven than Rooney's novels, even though I would never really describe Rooney's novels as plot-driven novels. There's just very little plot to The Idiot. It's really, really funny. I think it's a fairly deep book if you kind of spend the time with it. And it's just another book about a young woman finding herself at school. It's really, really good. This next book is leaning more towards the romance side of Sally Rooney, and that is One Day by David Nicholls. One Day is about the 20-year-long romance between Dexter and Emma, and throughout the book we see their relationship from the same day every year for 20 years. And by that I mean we check in on them on July 15th, and then every subsequent July 15th as long as their relationship is going. As you might expect, this covers some really high highs, this covers some really low lows. Like Connell and Marianne, this isn't a relationship that's very easy for the two of them, but there's just this undeniable bond. What I love about this book is the exploration of kind of misconnections, or really bad timing with a relationship that should work, but the timing is just not right. And ultimately, I think this book is really about just how love fully consumes you in both good ways and bad. I feel like the next one is going to be hit or miss for some people, and that's The Interstings by Meg Wolitzer. If you love reading books about kind of precocious young women, and that was something you love with the Sally Rooney books you've read, I think you might get something out of The Interstings, which stars, I think, 6 young women. They meet at a summer camp in the 1970s, and the book kind of follows their friendship over the next couple of decades. And what I really like about this book is that it involves that time in your life when you think that you are so special, or you think that your brain is so powerful, or that you're destined for really great things, and then you grow up and you realize you're normal. And then what do you do with that? This book leans less on romantic relationships and more on friendship, but it's about really, really tight bonds nonetheless, and it's really, really good. I liked it a lot. Next up is Americanah by Chimimanda Ngozi Adichie. One of the things I think Rooney really lacks in her books is a different kind of experience, different perspectives other than her own. And I think that's what Americanah will give you, while giving you some vibes of a Rooney book. It stars 2 characters named Ifemelu and Obinze, who fall in love in Nigeria, but due to a military dictatorship, they need to leave the country, and unfortunately, they need to do so separately. Ifemelu lands in America, while Obinze finds himself in London. They live apart for the next 13 years, but they never really forget each other. That bond remains strong. And while it's about that relationship and about maintaining that bond, this book has some of that correspondence that people love in Beautiful World, Where Are You? It has that kind of rush of young love, 2 people trying to make something work despite just circumstances that are so much bigger than them. And it also has that, quintessential Rooney vibe of young people trying to make it in the world and finding out it's really, really hard to do, and it's even harder to do if you don't have, that person by your side. Next up is Sweetbitter by Stephanie Danler. If you wanted to know a little bit more about Allain and Eileen's job and maybe more of her story as someone struggling to make it in the literary world, but on kind of the lower rungs of it, I think you might enjoy Sweetbitter. But at the same time, this is not about the literary world. This is not in the UK. This is about a woman named Tess, who is 22, who lives in New York City, who works as a waitress. Like normal people, Sweetbitter got a TV show made out of it. This one I think was on Stars. It's originally how I found out about the book, actually. And I think the Rooney fans who will like this one are the ones who kind of lean into the more kind of chaotic side of her books. This is a book that involves kind of love and lust and dive bars and champagne and cocaine. It has a love triangle that's really difficult for everyone involved. This really reminded me of Rooney in the ways that these characters find themselves being drawn into things that are kind of maybe darker than you might expect, but are really like strangely alluring at the same time. If you're someone who's really interested in the restaurant industry, I think you'd like this book. If you're someone who loves books kind of set in that kind of New York at night, I think you'd really like this book. Next up is Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami, and not just because Harry Styles loves that book and I'm in love with Harry Styles. I think there's actually quite a lot of similarities between this Murakami and a lot of what Sally Rooney has been doing with her 3 books. Just from like a prose standpoint, I think they're very similar. They're both kind of really clean, they're really simple, but at the same time, they're giving you kind of profound stuff that's really entertaining. But with Norwegian Wood, just like Rooney, I don't think you'd ever really hold up the prose as like the reason why they're so good at what they do. They're both very simple on purpose. But even outside of that, I think it shares a lot with normal people in that the book is really about kind of this big romance that happens at a university. But what's interesting about it in comparison to what Rooney does is that this is about a man and not a woman. There's a similar kind of like hopelessness to, I think, both of these books, but I think Norwegian Wood has more of a kind of classical romance feel to it. Not like a romance book, but like the romance has more of a classic feel than what you'd see in a Rooney book. Next is The Course of Love by Allain de Botton, a book that I'm always like so blown away by because he wrote this book when I think he was 23, which makes no sense. How does someone who is 23 years old have this much knowledge and wisdom about the concept of love? It always blows me away every single time I read this book. What's nice about The Course of Love is that it stars like completely normal, average people kind of before their romance, during their romance, after parts of their romance, and just he kind of elevates a normal relationship into something that just feels like really big and epic and beautiful, even though it's like completely mundane at the same time. If you're someone who is drawn to the romance element of Rooney's books, I would really implore you to read this book. It's really, really beautiful and speaks about kind of the concept of romance in a way that I haven't seen very many books do, or any books at all. Botton does this really cool thing throughout the book where he kind of removes himself, or he presents himself as almost like a voice of God, kind of in the margins of the book, giving you all this like really, really great commentary on romances. I mean, Botton's a philosopher and he's like a genius of a person, so just like hearing his thoughts on anything are usually really, really interesting, but to hear him talk about romance is particularly beautiful. And then when you think of how young he was when he wrote this, it'll just blow you away. And that's something that he shares with Rooney, because Rooney, got her claim to fame when she was in her mid-20s. Just earlier today, I was actually making a list of books that have won the Lambda Prize for bisexual fiction, and Susan Choi's name came up, and that totally, it was just perfect timing because it reminded me of a book that would go so well for this list, and that's Trust Exercise. Like a lot of books on this list, this is about young love or a young relationship, and this is about a couple named David and Sarah? I think it's Sarah. But what's fun about this is that it takes place at a performing arts school, I think in the 80s, might be the 90s, I think it's the 80s. These are people who are particularly passionate in very expressive ways, and then they encounter this very passionate, very expressive love between each other. But what separates Trust Exercise from every other book on this list is just how you'll be questioning the reality of the situation as you're reading it. Throughout a lot of this book, the romance and the plot feels very straightforward, but then at a certain point, some things happen and you start to question, like, how much of this was actually real? How much of this telling is actually false? How does that affect what is going on? It's a really, really smart book, and I feel like Susan Choi is not talked about like nearly enough. This next one might sound like a joke to normal people fans, but this is called Ordinary People by Diana Evans. I think this might appeal a little bit more to conversation with friends, fans, maybe Beautiful World, Where Are You? As it deals with two couples and how they're kind of learning to navigate the world. I think this one will appeal to people who are ready for Rooney's books to go a little bit further along in the timeline than what Rooney seems to be interested in. So far, Rooney is very laser focused on a very specific time in people's lives. You're kind of early to mid 20s, kind of your late 20s, early 30s. But this book goes a little bit further throughout these people's lives, and it goes into parenting and grief and aging. So if you like Rooney but are in the mood for maybe more of a next step kind of book, Ordinary People might be just what you're looking for. Next is a book called Tender by Belinda McKeon, which takes place in Dublin, again, during college. It follows a kind of sheltered young girl named Catherine, and she meets a man named James while she's at college, and he's more of kind of this, bigger, more adventurous spirit. So while Catherine starts to kind of open herself up and take on all these new experiences, James's life gets hard in a number of ways, and their relationship becomes very difficult to maintain as his life kind of continues to spiral out of control. What's really beautiful about this book is it explores that feeling of when you really are wanting to help somebody, but they're in a situation that you really can't help them out of, and by you putting more and more effort into this, are you really making it worse? Just as a reminder to myself about what exactly went on in this book, before I talked about it, I just looked up Tender on Goodreads, and it has just the perfect line to describe this book. It says it's about the lies we tell ourselves, and then it is about the lies we are taught to tell. And that's just like the perfect way to encapsulate this book and what makes it so interesting. I think Rooney fans would really like this book because it's about that kind of young love, but it also has that really smart, psychological insight that Rooney's kind of famous for. Why Rooney is so captivating for people is because she just, every now and then she just hits something on the head, and she gets to just the core of an issue, and you feel it just so deep in your bones, and I feel like Tender has a lot of that going on for it as well. Next is Everyone in This Room Will Soon Be Dead by Emily Austen. This is a book that I actually read just last month. This is a book that's very funny, but it's also very sweet, and it's very kind of provoking, and if you're someone who likes maybe the more God-centered aspects of Beautiful World, Where Are You? I would suggest you pick this one up. This book stars a woman named Gilda, who is an atheist who kind of falls backwards into a job at a church. She was actually showing up there thinking there was free therapy offered. The priest there thinks that she was there for kind of a job application that he had put out, and she's just kind of unexpectedly working at this church. I don't want to say too much about it because I think part of the joy of this book is just seeing how it unfolds. But if you're like a vibes person and you really like the vibes of a Rooney book, I think you'll like the vibe of this book as well. Rooney is heralded as kind of like the voice of the millennial generation, and I think that's wrong in a way, or it's not specific enough. I think Rooney is the voice of a very specific part of the millennial generation, specifically kind of a young woman's voice, particularly white, middle class, or middle class to well off, who is just struggling through the relationships in her life. And if that's the aspect of Rooney that you really like, I would recommend 3 Rooms by Jo Hamya. This is a book that explores 3 different living situations from young, millennial women. It explores their living conditions, both on the low end and more of an idealized level. And what I think she actually is doing better than Rooney here is that she's showing kind of different experiences. She's presenting more of a broad young millennial woman's spectrum. It's very, very good. And it is apparently a take on A Room of One's Own, which is a book that I've actually never read. So if you like A Room of One's Own, apparently there's an even deeper level that you will absolutely love. But I didn't read it. And I still love the book anyway. The next 2 books were compared very heavily with normal people, I think, when they came out. And as a result, I think, kind of paradoxically, I think they both got more attention than maybe otherwise would have. But also, I don't think they were taken as seriously as they otherwise would have, because I think they were just kind of easily dismissed as Rooney clones or Rooney knockoffs. And I just don't think that's what they really are. I think that was so lazy for people to do. That was just too easy to put them in that kind of box. The first is Topics of Conversation by Miranda Popkey. And this is a book that almost exclusively involves just conversations by different types of women. This has been described as like a novel in stories. And if you like Rooney because you feel like what she's talking about is just so real, and she's kind of cutting through the bullshit and talking about young people and relationships and showing just how raw those can be, I think you'd really like Topics of Conversations. Sorry, conversation. It's Topic of Conversation. I have conversations with friends on the brain, so I added the S in there. And finally is a book that I actually haven't read, but it's been compared so heavily to Rooney, I think it bears mentioning, and that's Exciting Times by Dolan. This is about a young woman named Ava who's fresh out of school, has just become a teacher. She's living in Hong Kong and is really struggling, and I guess it's like a really great look at wealth and class and even gender. I think she's compared so much to Rooney because they both love to focus on kind of twisted millennial relationships, but they both are, obviously young women who are writing these. They're both kind of known for their kind of smart, acerbic wit. From what I've seen of her, I think Dolan is funnier than Rooney, but also Exciting Times seems to have more of a nihilism that I don't necessarily think Rooney has. So there you go. There's 15 books to read if you've read everything that Sally Rooney has to offer and you're just not done with her yet. Obviously, with a list like this, not all of these books are going to work for you. Hopefully some of them will. If some of them don't be really mean. I tried my best here. But given that Rooney has been saddled with this title of being like the writer for the millennial generation, I just push back on that a little bit, because there's a lot of other people doing some similar things, some better, some worse than Rooney, but there's a lot of people playing in the same space. And I think they're worth mentioning, I think they're worth reading, and I think they're worth your time. You might not like every book on this list, but I guarantee you every one of these books is worth your time. Thanks so much for watching. My name is Rick McDonnell. I'll see you in a couple days. Bye.